Hi, everyone, and welcome to another webinar in the series Restart 2021, where we examine the post-pandemic issues that will affect our companies, both SMEs and large organizations, and also at a macro level. And today we're dealing with a topic that has been, challenging us since independence, really, which is red tape. In the beginning of 2021, His Excellency the President um, appointed a commission to look at easing some of the laws in the country and regulations. And the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, together with the German Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Sri Lanka, the delegation uh, of the German Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Sri Lanka, put together a report on easing the regulations and some of the laws that have impacted our businesses. And today's webinar is looking at this very topic, and I have taken some of the some of the matters that have been raised in that report, which was handed over to the Secretary, to His Excellency the President, a few months back. And we're looking at how, as a country, we can look at easing these regulations and red tape, and kind of, taking the country forward. The Friedrich Naumann Foundation Freedom and Economy Next have put together this series, the content, you can view it on the Economy Next and also on the Ceylon magazine as well. I am truly delighted to be joined by three very eminent panelists who had to deal with red tape, not just on behalf of individual organizations, but the kind of bodies that they have represented over the last few decades. First, I have with me Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Shiran.
Thanks, Imran, for having me.
Thank you. And I'm also joined by Roshan Perera, Senior Research Fellow at the Advocata Institute. Welcome, Roshan.
Thank you, Imran.
And last but not least, Saliya Wikramasuriya, who is a member of the Colombo Port City Commission. Welcome, Saliya.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, all of these three eminent personalities have had numerous other roles, and a simple Google search will find you their more, their fuller biography, which I have excluded at this point to get on with today's webinar. I'm going to start with you, Shiran. When you look at our attractiveness as an investment location, when you look at the tables produced by various international organizations, we hover somewhere in the middle of these tables and have been so for quite a while now. I think we need to go higher up in terms of the attractiveness. What are the main areas that we need to address to kind of move up in these leagues of tables?
Thanks, Imran. So there's, of course, the official indicators, which such as the World Bank Ease of Doing Business, which right now I think is on a momentary pause or could get refined depending on what the World Bank decides to do next. But if you look at the history of it, as you quite rightly mentioned, we've been swinging from maybe around 80 to 110 in the last 10 to 15 years. But it's really been a lot of the similar reasons or the issues or the subcategories really where we have really fallen through on as well. And I think interestingly, even from a South Asian and even from an Asian perspective, a lot of the other countries have relatively done much better. Of course, countries like India, of course, have done better and given a lot of focus on it, while also realizing how to advance in these indices as well through carefully crafted reform policies as well. But if you look at an index like the World Bank Ease of Doing Business, we can see subcategories like registering property, getting credit, paying taxes, trading across border, as well as even enforcing contracts, where Sri Lanka really do worse than their overall ranking. So if you're ranked around 99 overall, we are ranked 130, 140, and even in some of these subcategories around 160. So these are what's dragging our overall place as well. And we fall behind a lot of the other countries which have typically attracted FDI, at least in this region, like Malaysia, like Vietnam, like Thailand, and India, which have comparatively, if you look at a comparative performance of Sri Lanka versus these countries, are doing much better in most of these indices, and in particular, even certain African and sub-Saharan countries as well. Sri Lanka doesn't do too greatly in these 4 or 5 indicators that I mentioned as well. So that's where we're kind of dropping off as well. But if you look at things like beyond the index, I think there are a lot of other things that matter for businesses, like paying taxes. You mentioned the Deregulation Commission and the Chamber sent across a lot of submissions from the private sector, from the members, in particular on taxation. How can we really get rid of unnecessary documentation for registration, like even related to SVAT or even tax clearance certifications? How can those be simplified? A few years back, to pay kind of income taxes as well, RAMIS was introduced, but there are a lot of issues surrounding operational issues around that, which the private sector finds quite not conducive for ease of doing business as well. And I think the other aspect is not only bringing these systems in, but really having it updated, so that when you go to pay the next update, or you don't get another return saying that you haven't filed it before, even though it has already been done. So database is really not being updated as well. And of course, I think other areas like para-tariffs, customs act, national single window, things that the private sector has really been talking about for the last 15 to 20 years, but we've seen very slow progress. And I think that's primarily why, whether we're looking at the index or we're looking at other factors, why we're kind of stuck in the middle compared to a lot of other countries which are doing much well on deregulation.
Thanks, Shiran. I think we have a lot to unpack, and I'll get into that as we go along. But Roshan, one of the things that I think many have pointed out as a hindrance to kind of removing these regulations is a disproportionate, role that the state plays in the economy, right? And there is a lot of vested interest in terms of not, moving on some of these. A lot of people assume that we actually liberalized the economy in 1977, but if you look at the commanding heights of the economy, there are large sectors that are government monopolies, right? And the inefficiencies in them get then translated down, down to even the SME. Take the state power monopoly, right? Like the CEP, that the cost of power is one of the highest in the world. So how can a Sri Lankan SME compete from a global perspective and so on? So how do we, tackle these state-owned monopolies in a way that, protects all stakeholders, but brings about significant reforms? Then that filter down into the rest of the economy as well.
Yes, Imran, I think you've hit it. You got it quite right, actually, because some of the SOEs are the largest institutions really commercial institutions operating in this country, and any inefficiencies that are generated in those in sectors, because they feed into the rest of the economy. You mentioned CEB or CPC or any of those sectors. The inefficiencies there would feed into the rest of the economy. And you also rightly pointed out the main factor is actually because they operate either as monopolies or as oligopolistic in an oligopolistic environment, and this is because there are certain legal or regulatory barriers, or either technological or economic barriers really to entry. And I just want to focus on one industry, I think, which has sort of had a lot of been in the news recently, and that's the gas industry. So basically, if you take the gas industry, there are just two players in the market. One is a state entity, but there's also a private entity. And you would expect that if there's a private entity, it should create more competition in the industry. So there should be more, it should be more efficient. But unfortunately, there are several factors that prevent that from being so. And one of it is actually price controls. And this has led to severe market distortions. And in recent times, we've actually seen the worst manifestation of these distortions in the form of these shortages and queues and such like. But these are only sort of seen costs, there are also unseen costs, where because of these price controls, investors are unwilling to even make long-term investments because they're unsure if they will be making, adequate return on their investments due to these controls, and it therefore leads to underinvestment in this sector. And we've seen this in other sectors as well, in these large sort of utilities, particularly. But the second thing is also that there are barriers to entry into these sectors. And if you just continue with this example of gas, it's quite a high capital intensive industry in the sense that you need these huge high storage facilities, and there are certain restrictions on setting up such facilities in the current environment, and therefore it prevents these new entrants from coming into the industry and making it more competitive, and developing a more competitive market. But what if you have sort of common storage facilities and you allow other players in the market? It would make it more competitive, and as a result, you would. I think what you are also alluding to is how can you make it more efficient, and also how can you keep prices down so that people, the consumer benefits from it. So I think that by bringing in more players, I think you can make it more competitive in that way and have this downward pressure on prices. So I think the key there is that SOEs need to operate in a more sort of be subject to more market competition, because that will lead to greater efficiencies, improved service and performance. And I think the classic example from the Sri Lankan context is the telecom industry in Sri Lanka. Because of the privatization and deregulation, they allowed more sort of entrance into the market, and as a result, this industry sector became more efficient and it became more sort of responsive to consumer needs. But here again, there are some issues, as we know from this industry. I mean, there's various pricing issues and things like that. And there, of course, the whole issue of having a proper regulatory framework comes into play, and an independent regulator, but that's a complete whole new area, so I won't go into it, but I'll just leave it there.
I think you've added a lot of things that we need to ponder as well. I'm going to come to Saliya because you've held many hats. You've run the BOI before, and you've obviously run you're in a pivotal position in the Port City Commission as well. I mean, looking at our location, and access to major markets, the kind of free trade agreements we have, the kind of FDI we have brought into this country, over a large period of time, is much below our potential. And I know investors have kind of alluded to three main things, one of which Roshan was talking about in terms of the barriers, but also the cumbersome and slow approval process, access to land, right, and also ceilings. We had logistical players in one of our webinars in this series who talked about the ceiling on how much shipping companies can own, right? And today we are talking about a value chain where the shipping companies are trying to control the entire value chain, as opposed to being forced to partner with someone else. How can we reach the potential of where FDI needs to be? Saliya, what are the kind of steps we need to take?
Thanks, Imran. I think I'll seize upon the thread that Roshan and Shiran have touched on, which is, I think, at the root cause of one of the aspects of the issue, and that is dominant government presence in the economy, which in turn leads to government control or efforts to control certain sectors, which in turn leaves those sectors open to influence and lobbying at certain government institutions, ministries, and so on and so forth. So I believe we can't have our cake and eat it. I think we've got to let go of something. And in this case, I think control is what we need to let go of, because with control comes the ability to make mistakes. And by that I mean, take a given policy of a given sector at a given time in any given government. Every government brings into being certain policies. Now the challenge is taking those policies from what they are, which is the highest thinkings of the government, to operationalization, which is a proper blend of debt and equity in instruments of investment, that requires good regulations. And what's missing in many of these sectors is good international class transparent regulations on how the rules should be applied. And this is what investors ultimately end up looking at. They look at, how can I get in? How can I stay in? How can I get out? Where is my return on investment? How do I commercialize this? How do I mitigate against this? And how do I seek recourse for this? Now, we have the right idea. We have a fabulous product. As you correctly said, we have a fantastic combination of virtual, which are all the trade agreements and market access mechanisms, and the physical, which is our location, which has already been leveraged by our shipping and maritime logistics sector to a great extent. I mean, we are ranked number 22 or 23 in the world in terms of container handling through ports. So that's not a small size of the pie. However, when the narrative is spun, we tend to leave it at the narrative and don't support it with the structure required for investors to actually take a step. Now, this brings in a theory of marketing and sales, which is that you can increase the awareness of people about an opportunity, and you can do so very successfully and globally. But in order to actually make somebody invest, which is to do what in the oil and gas sector is known as the FDI, FID, final investment decision, there needs to be something called a compelling event. A compelling event is what is going to be what drives that person to take that decision, to go to the board, get the approvals required, because Sri Lanka is the best place to be for them at that time. We haven't been very good at identifying these compelling events. And the problem with that is because we need to get to identify compelling events change from person to person. So the necessity is to, while we market ourselves broadly, to seek proper investment, is to get inside the minds of each and every individual investor and understand what their pain points are, what their business process is, what their revenue models are, and seek the compelling event within that structure. If we can actually engage on a one-to-one basis with not more than 10 or 15 international investors who are perhaps in this area because they've already taken the step to move outside their own jurisdiction, then I think we can have that conversation a lot more successfully. Right now, we are leaving those conversations to promoters and people in the private sector, which is not itself a bad thing. It's just that the full weight of government influence to make something a success cannot be brought to bear. As a result, there's a lot left up in the air, a lot left to somebody else to sort out, and a lot of grandfathering that could be done by the government that's not getting done. From an investor's point of view, they need, above all, especially in an economy which is state-dominated, they need the state to be speedy in action. And if they perceive that the state is not speedy in action, or is expressing some sort of distancing themselves from the key questions or the hard questions, then it's not going to be very compelling to them. So I think over the years, we've succeeded in building ourselves a fantastic story to sell, but we haven't used the network that we have in place to sell it well enough. My personal preference, even when I was in the BOI, we cut down on these broad-based scattergun roadshows and had dialogues with the existing investors who to see what could be leveraged from their own networks, because one testimonial is worth 1,000 printed words. So from that point of view, we haven't maintained a very strong focus on the individual business case for investors. And I think in Sri Lanka's case, the same applies for the port city. We're looking at the moment focusing on what we would like to call anchor investors. Again, it's a fantastic value proposition if put in the right sense, but an anchor investor will need a customized approach, and that customized approach in some ways overcomes many of the regulatory barriers and much of the red tape, as you call it. And that's, I think, something we need to learn is there's a difference between marketing the proposition and making the actual sale.
Pitch to them. They had certain regulatory concerns around, night working for women, data protection. Obviously, they're not too worried about land because they were quite happy to, the HSBC as a company, is quite comfortable with leasing versus actually owning. But I think it was a very targeted pitch, and I think thousands of Sri Lankans have worked in that organization because of that very targeted. I remember how we addressed it as well. So I completely agree with the approach that you are mentioning. Shiran and Roshan, anything to add to what Saliya said? Because I think FDI is a critical part in long-term growth. Do you feel anything that you need to add to what Saliya was saying on that front?
I think I'll just add something on I think also on the labor reforms. And I think that's one thing that we really need to look at, because the cost of hiring, I think, is very high comparative to other sort of countries around in the region. So we are not really a low-cost destination in that sense in terms of labor. So I think that's one area. And the other one is, of course, infrastructure. I know in certain areas we are very strong in the infrastructure, but there are still a lot of infrastructure gaps, which we need to address, and particularly, I think, in terms of the digital infrastructure. So I just a few things that I think we also need to think about to be able to attract investment.
Go ahead, Shiran. Yeah.
Historically have banked on giving long tax holidays, other trade tax incentives as well. It's really investor is looking for more than that, and the more than that is that policy consistency, so that they can have a know what the path is, at least for the next 5 to 10 to even 15 years and beyond. So I think historically we've relied on giving tax incentives because we haven't really done deregulation and sometimes over-regulated certain markets. So we've done that trade-off, and usually the trade-off has been on the tax side, and of course that has had implications for our fiscal side as well. So it's something it's difficult to unravel, because there has to be some level of incentive or some level of attraction for these investors to come in. But for them, from their perspective, consistency is the main thing. And I think one of the other aspects also investors are looking for, especially on the manufacturing side, is land, and really almost having available land where you can just plug and play without just having land which is just underdeveloped and the investor having to do everything from scratch. I think so. Just those two areas.
Interesting. Why don't these regulations get simplified? Why does the red tape persist? And I think I personally have had numerous conversations with, just like Shiran, with investors, potential investors, other business owners, and one issue keeps coming up, and that is the issue of corruption. As long as laws and regulations appear to be convoluted, and kind of it opens the door for those who are interpreting those laws and regulations, to kind of make themselves, enrich themselves, and that's across all developing countries, not just Sri Lanka. I think that's a problem that exists. But in our case, I think we are reaching a very critical juncture in our development journey, and I think we need to really tackle this, much sooner than later. A question for all of you: how do we tackle corruption in Sri Lanka?
Let's look at it from this point of view. Making things easy for investors, and thereby simplifying the process of engagement and ironing out the pain points is not something to be done lightly. And so I'm saying that there is the need for regulating, and there is the need to regulate relevant parts of the business. So we can't do away with regulations completely. Due diligence is a person who they say they're going to be, is a person who they are, is a person who they say they are, is what I mean. All those things are important. Now, what I think is happening is a mixture of both. Regulations themselves are causing corruption because of the rent-seeking nature of many of these steps that are taken, the number of approvals required for everything. So there is value in reducing the number of steps, number of pain points to get any approvals, imposing deadlines, imposing if and or no response is heard by, etc., etc. This is fairly standard process in other parts of the world. But there's also a case of corruption causing regulation. Then that is because the government tendency, typically successive governments, to strangle the malintents of 5%, they actually inhibit the expansion potential of 95. So from that standpoint, we again need to be a little smart about how we deregulate. I think we must deregulate. Margaret Thatcher did it extremely effectively in the UK in the 1980s. Thousands upon thousands of obsolete statutory notices, acts, regulations were removed. But we should also be mindful of the fact that we don't want to create another problem. And my last point on this is something I've been thinking about. Is let's say we have good policy, and let's say we have good regulation to support that policy, to drive it into operation equitably. What we often then tend to do is confuse things with numerous contrary circulars and gazettes, which act in a spirit that is intended to address a different problem but affects everybody else. Simple examples can be given, I won't bore you with them now, where a gazette that was issued for a particular purpose then puts a blanket dampener on any public sector official taking the initiative to do something in a different sector. So I think we must be mindful of not just the policy, but the regulations, and also the sometimes ad hoc intervention in those policies by way of different circulars, because every single thing the government does sends a message, and that message goes to places we can't control. And if you're looking at investment from outside, we must be mindful of the messages we are sending.
Roshan, Shiran?
Just to add to that, because we're looking for the government's point of view, I think one area is really transparency. I think there's this whole thing of open government initiative, which to enable citizens to have sort of greater oversight over the operations of government and to strengthen accountability. And I think the Right to Information Act was one major step in this process. But I think there again, its implementation is key, because it's not just having the act, you have to also have that enabling environment to facilitate, and make it sort of implementable. And one area in that I think which government, we really need to get government to use more this whole thing of technology, because I think that's a powerful tool to combat corruption. One thing is it can help to minimize this human interaction. I think that's what Sally was talking about as well. And the other one is also to enable the collection of lots of information and data, which for one thing that can be shared between institutions, but also can be made available to public for scrutiny, and therefore improve accountability. But it's not only it's not just technology. You need the strong institutions that are able to do that, to be able to implement these processes and procedures. And you also need to give the incentives to the public officials to be incentivized to actually provide this kind of information accurately and in a timely way, which is in a way that people can actually use that information. And you also need this collaboration between sectors, not just government. And we always when we talk about corruption, we only talk about the government, but I think there are two hands to clap. So it's basically, you also need to get the private sector also has to be involved, and also citizens, so civil society and citizens. But this corruption is, I think, not only within borders. I think now we're seeing it also across international jurisdictions. So you also need that kind of collaboration between jurisdictions to be able to address corruption, I think.
Especially in terms of procurement, I think we did see a National Procurement Commission that was there. Unfortunately, I think in its previous mode, it didn't have really the teeth to, they could only flag, but they couldn't really act beyond it, I think, because it didn't have its the powers vested with it. Unfortunately, now that commission is no longer there, so there isn't a real procedure, at least within within government or in policy, which really scrutinizes procurement, and I think it's really now at a singular level, maybe at the finance ministry or at a ministry level, where some of these procurements are being done. So I think we need to maybe bring back some of those measures. Maybe some of those things weren't working or wasn't working fast enough, but at least they were, being able to highlight certain gaps as well. And on the other side, I think, as Roshan mentioned, some of the legislation has been there. For example, Sri Lanka was one of the first countries in the region to bring in digital signatures through the Electronic Transaction Act, but uh, we're not seeing too many institutions or even the private sector really making full use of it. So I think those are the low-hanging fruits in terms of adoption, which can then minimize the need for manual processes taking place, and thereby reducing uh, corruption in that way as well. So just two thoughts there.
Very good ideas came out of that, part of our discussion. Smart regulation, data, digitization, better coordination, incentivization of public servants. I think there is a lot that can be done. And just to add to what Shiran said, the CFO of one of the largest apparel companies was on one of our on this series, and he's talking about how during the pandemic, they had accepted digital signatures, but then after the country opened up, the request keeps coming saying, hey, we want the physical version of this document as well. So I think you're throwing the baby with the bathwater. As we come out, I think that's something that we can look at, and I think there is an appetite for some sort of reform. But I think dealing with day-to-day issues of foreign exchange and so on, I think this agenda of reform, which was at the beginning of at least this regime, seems to have kind of gone down. But I hopefully, as we tackle COVID, the appetite for reform might come up again. I think a very good example would be the driving license. I think that has kind of got really cleaned up. I know many people who have spoken very favorably of that process having been, cleaned up. Obviously, it's been handled by the military, but hopefully we'll have civilian officers completely handle that. But that process, I'm told, is much, much cleaner than many, many years before. So I think there is some hope in terms of tackling it. Roshan, I want to come to one point that we needed to talk about. We spoke about FDI, but we also need to talk about trade, because one critical aspect for SMEs and also large corporates is, seamless trade is a critical part of plugging into global supply chains. And in that respect, one area where there's a lot of red tape is in trade. That's both exports and imports. What are the biggest barriers that you see for seamless trade in Sri Lanka, and how can we tackle these barriers?
In terms of size and per capita, trade has to play a major role in its growth strategy, and I think everybody has to focus on how do we increase our trade, particularly exports, really. And then although Sri Lanka is probably, I think, one of the first countries in South Asia to open its borders to trade and foreign direct investment, it now, if you look at this trade openness index, it has fallen way below most countries. And I was just looking at the index today, and in 2020, the index has fallen to something like 39.5, so under 40, which is very low in comparison, because even in 2020, the world average was something like 86.4. Of course, you have Singapore, which is like 300% and such like. But still, even in comparison to us in 2000, which is kind of the highest trade openness that we had, it was something like 88%. So we're really, quite low in this index. So this is something that we have to address. And as you said, I think it's the regulatory barriers. And I think Verite had done this very detailed study, particularly focusing on the agriculture sector. But I think some of the things that they identified cuts across all exports. So I think one of the major issues that all exporters complain about is the regulatory barriers in terms of high tariff rates. And this is, our tariff rates are high compared to even other developing countries. And yes, tariff rates are supposed to protect domestic industries, but what happens is if they are too high, then they become anti-competitive, and they even affect even our export industries. And I think that was seen, that is being seen now, particularly with this current uh, regulatory, the new import restrictions that are coming, plus these non-tariff barriers, which are these import restrictions, where we've had this sort of across-the-board import restrictions, which have had an adverse impact on on exports. I mean, there is sort of this, case by case basis. You've got to go, and then again you come back to this red tape, because you have to actually go, and get each import for whatever the exporter needs to be removed. You have to go basically back to customs to get it done. So there's a lot of red tape involved there. But I'd also like to say something about the currency, the exchange rate policy, because that is again a regulatory barrier, because it is a price control in a sense, right? You're controlling the price of foreign exchange. And that again, it has an anti-export bias, because basically you are favoring imports versus exports by keeping your currency at a rate which is maybe not the market rate as we see it. So I think those are some regulatory barriers that need to be addressed, and addressed very quickly, because unless we improve exports, we are going to be, we won't be able to come out of the, at least in the long term, we won't be able to come out of this macro situation that we're in. But also there are procedural barriers. I think the budget this time tried to address some of those, because they identified, particularly for, startups, and then also that there are difficulties in registering a business. So I think these are some things that need to be addressed, but it needs to be across the board. You can't not piecemeal. I think there has to be sort of an across the board identification of what are these barriers, and then addressing those. But at least it's a start in terms of some of the things that were addressed in this budget. And the other one is, of course, information, because I think the lack of information is another barrier for exporters, because you don't know, what kind of exports are available. I know the chambers provide a lot of information, but from the regulatory authorities, I think there's a lack of information. I know there's a trade information portal, but whether that is updated regularly, whether there is accurate information, or all the information is available, I think these are some things that can be addressed. And these are again low-hanging fruit. I mean, these are don't cost a lot of money, but would have a huge impact on exports. So I think these are some things just that can urgently be done, actually, and done with fairly not a lot of not a lot of expense, but would have a huge impact on exports.
You dealt with many stakeholders in both export and the import sector. Anything to add on that, where we can simplify those?
Talk about free trade agreements and a lot of other things, but before we get into that, really, you need to put your own house in order. And I think the biggest issue I think a lot of our trade negotiators face is multiple para-tariffs that are in place, which when we go into these negotiation tables come up always. And how do you phase it out without disrupting the trade? How does that, because of contribution of trade taxes to overall fiscal revenue, how do you do it in a smart way as well? So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation in that way, because we want to add FTAs like China, Bangladesh, or whatever other countries are being talked about, but we also need to look at the trade components as well. So I think those are few of the areas as well. But there are tools being developed. I think the trade information portal Roshan mentioned, it's being used, and even right now, the chamber, I think a couple of weeks back, chamber together with one of the institutions, took these, did a workshop, are continuing to do workshops in the regions, trying to educate the SME exporters that these facilities are available, to get the knowledge out there, how to use it, what to look for, and also get the feedback from them as to what information they are looking for. So I think there's a role that the private sector chambers and chambers like ourselves, and also private sector, can play in getting these tools more use. And of course, you have other tools, market access tools, like I think the EDB has a tool to market products as well, but that's more on a B2B basis and more on trading products. But how can you get those used much more and really connect some of the SME exporters like you've seen in other countries which have like their SME export portals as well? How can you really get the usability side of it? So there are, I think, as Roshan mentioned, there are piecemeal things that are happening, but really connecting the dots between these two, so that when you go to the negotiating table for these FTAs or any other strategic tool, we know what we're negotiating with and what the advantages will be for the country, without always then coming back and having kind of backlashes when these are signed.
To add to what Roshan said in terms of the trade aspect of Sri Lanka, we've always been pivotal. It is said that in the old days we connected Rome with Peking. So from that point of view, Sri Lanka has lived on trade since the Middle Ages. It's just that as a byproduct of that activity, there have evolved certain things we don't look at closely enough, and certain things we look at too closely. Now, one of the things we look at too closely is the fear in any trade activity that there is leakage into the local market. Now, when you actually consider the size of the local market with respect to the potential activity that is being traded, the efforts expended at addressing those issues spawn huge amounts of red tape, which actually disincentivize anybody from coming into this business in Sri Lanka at all. And some of the things we don't look at, these are just anecdotal examples, we don't look at is take the shipping industry. We talked about the shipping industry. We are pretty significant in the world of shipping and maritime services. And we only provide less than 1%, around 0.5% of the world's bunker fuel sales. So for a port with a captive customer base that the Port of Colombo has, the fact that we're not selling more bunkers there implies several things, actually. There'll be lots of justification when you ask the industry about it. But what it means is people haven't spent enough time focusing on proactive policy intervention so as to bring the market potential up to what it actually could be, bring the market up to what the potential indicates it could be. So there are many, many different reasons for that. Primarily people protecting their own positions within the industry. Then there'll be people who perceive interventions as geopolitically laden. But all it needs is a very clear, simple, transparent national policy on how the industry as a whole can increase. And then that takes care of that. So I think there's the activity of trading brings with it all sorts of other different things that don't get a holistic look at.
How we should approach this problem, hopefully our policymakers will pay some attention as the crisis of COVID subsides. One thing that has kept coming up, with interactions with various stakeholders, Saliya, is this issue of coordination, and that really doesn't cost us much, except some effort in setting up the processes. There's lots of talks about one-stop shops and single windows, but the reality is different departments, particularly in government, but also within the private sector and also within government and private sector, they seem unable to come to some sort of the same table in terms of getting syncing with each other's thinking and acting as one voice. How do we increase coordination, not just within government, but also public and private parties?
In my humble opinion, Imran, the concept of a one-stop shop or single window facilitation is part mindset and part process. So if the particular stakeholder does not wish to take the problems of others and solve them, that no amount of process will assist that. Now, as far as I'm concerned, my driver is a one-stop shop for any number of different things. That guy will get out there and do whatever it takes in whatever place it is to make the desired event happen. And he's not enabled by law or forced by regulation to cooperate. So part of it is actually encouraging the business of a good customer-oriented attitude, which is something we have, I think, lost over the years. We've had it at one point. Now we've lost that because a lot of facilitation can be done informally. Now, when you get to the formal part of it, I'll speak for the Port City Act and what it purports to do, which is the introduction of a formal single window facilitation. It purports to do this by actually legislating that regulatory authorities have a physical presence in the Port City Commission premises, so as anybody coming there will actually be able to have the conversations required to get the approvals required that that agency would otherwise demand of the project. So that's a good approach. It is yet to be tested, but will very soon be tested, because ultimately, though, it's not, in my opinion, that's not the final solution. It's a means to get mindsets to that point where all of our public facing officials have that desire to participate in solving an investor's problem. So it's a team effort. You can legislate it. You can have people to have the customs, the immigration, the CEA, and all these other officers sitting here, but that's not really going to force them to do their job. No, it's something that must exist in the hearts and minds of the people involved in attempting to do so. It's so easy to have all the power and still not be interested in helping. So my view on that is that we must encourage places where service has been seen, and I think somebody mentioned the driving license. In my limited experience here in Sri Lanka, there have been 3 or 4 centers of excellence, periodic. They come and they go. One of them is the driving license, the DVLC. There was a time when it was an absolutely humming machine. The other one was the pensions department. I believe that is still a very, very customer-oriented place of call. And the third is the ID and passport office. That again went up and then went down, but we have been through periods of greatness where institutions that are not even being mandated to or required to cooperate, collaborate, and assist have done so because of the mindset that has been inculcated within them. So to a great deal, I think it requires putting the right people in the right places and giving them the freedom to act. And that my last little point on that is when we delegate to officials the responsibility of taking a decision, I think we must recognize that those who delegate must be responsible for that decision. Me delegating it to a manager and then holding them responsible for whatever happens isn't the desired management style. You've got to be the boss that empowers your people and stands by them. And that part also we find a little bit lacking, because individual institutions have so many levels of hierarchy that everybody needs to go up. Now, if you talk to Sri Lanka Customs, you will find that officers in one branch do not wish to engage even with officers in another branch, because that's not their job. So we have compartmentalized ourselves by effectively truncating accountability and responsibility. Those are little thoughts. But in Port City, we plan to remove the obstacles for any transaction we can possibly think of by way of keeping transparency, using, as Roshan mentioned, technology to accomplish certain objectives, while still making it as painless an experience as possible. It's taking a little time to compose that product, but when it comes out, it will offer a different customer experience than we would expect to have outside.
The great hope, at least in the short term, is the Port City, and I hope that I think we wish you all the best in terms of what you do. Shiran and Roshan, anything to add on the coordination part? I think it doesn't really cost much. It's just a mindset, as Saliya said, because I am aware that some of these departments that had huge improvements in their customer service was because the head decided, that was it. We need to really make significant changes. But when the head left, then there is another deterioration. So therefore, we haven't really, sorted out the problem. We've just had temporary improvements. Shiran, Roshan, anything to add on the coordination part?
Yeah, just to add one thing, I think I'll go back to talking about the incentive structure. I think that is very important because government officials, I think there's a tendency to have to fear that you either lose your job or you're not going to be as important when you give over some of these responsibilities. But I think you have to change the incentive structure, and I think they also need to understand the overall objective. I mean, what are we really aiming at? Are we aiming at keeping our little turf and keeping that within the department, or is there a higher objective really? So I think that needs to be inculcated in the entire government service actually, or government sector. Not only government, I think it's entire mindset change really. And also giving the right incentives so people, and I'm not talking about salary, because salary is actually only a small part. There are so many other incentives. I mean, how did those, we need to look at those as case studies actually, to see how did those particular institutions transform from what they were to where they are now, and how did the government officials actually do that job, or make that transformation. So I think those are some things, that lessons that we need to learn from those, and try to replicate them, or try to make it much more ubiquitous kind of across all departments.
Yeah, I think just to add to this, I think if you look at the passport office and a few other agencies, there is obviously an incentive to process it. There are what you call SOPs in place. So it's really keeping those functional, keeping those alive. And of course, institutions need to be well led. You could have a very charismatic leader that people buy into and believe, and then the change will happen. But beyond that, you might need an institution person to continue these practices. So I think there's a lot of focus on public sector, and even the need to do better. And I think even in the recent budget, you saw a lot of focus on reducing the wastage, and part of that is coming through better coordination and reducing and giving more ownership really for them to come up with better plans, better budgets, the way they spend, how they staff. So I think hopefully that culture is sort of created in, so that you don't really need a person particularly.
Shiran, the question to you, running out of time, so I want to focus a very specific question to you, and I have a very important general question for all of you at the end. Labor market reforms, Roshan mentioned it, the IT BPM industry, which I've been very closely associated with, have been, trying, particularly on the night working regulations for a long time. Every government has put this on their to-do list, labor market reforms, but they've we've made very little headway really in terms of making reforms. I'll give a personal example. When I was running Strascom, I went and did a presentation to National Labour Advisory Council on the night working regulations for female workers. The minister was there, all the trade unions were there. They looked at everything and said, "Oh, what a wonderful industry! You take care of your workers. We have no objections to the kind of specific regulations that you wanted lifted." But nothing happens, right? Because there is a political incentive not to make changes on labor market regulation. But it's critical, right, that these changes are done, because investors today can compare very easily the kind of labor market regulations in the jurisdictions that they are considering to invest in. How can we tackle this bugbear in terms of labor market reforms?
So I think it's the way that these issues are brought up. So, for example, we saw in last time's budget how the private sector retirement age was extended, and there wasn't really a public policy debate or anything like that. But post it, really everyone had a view, and it went on, and then finally I think the bill got passed with a few provisions. So I think it's the way that these things are put out. And maybe it shouldn't be from these statements, but rather using frameworks like this National Labour Advisory Council to really force upon it. And I think right now it's a really great opportunity because, post-COVID really, especially in the services industry, um, some of these regulations really are not even applicable. I mean, we are looking at a labor act which is so many years back. Then we're looking at frameworks like TEBA, which is also quite old. Uh, there isn't provisions for part-time work, contract work, a lot of gray areas there. Other countries are moving to 4-day weeks and other things as well. But it's I think a really slow process to get there. But I think that is also the opportunity to get especially more women into the labor force, because really pandemic kind of highlighted and spotlighted the impact it does have on families and uh, females who are working in the labor force, and even males, because I mean, stuck at home, they have to now play a bigger role as well. So really, these laws need to keep up, and I think it's economic situation like this highlights the need for these uh, tools which are cross-cutting. If you look at education or even labor, these now need to move forward. Otherwise, investors will, as you said, will think of another particular country. What has made Sri Lanka especially attract a lot of IT firms is the skills, not necessarily on the labor side. But if the labor side gets sorted, I think there'll be a lot of opportunity and lot more people willing to come in. And things like shift work, I think in the IT industry is taking place, but really a lot of those provisions are not even in these acts governing it. So I think there's a lot of discussion needs to be had, but really a roadmap to how we can get to that needs to be established without it being preempted, either in a budget speech or some other statement, which then arouses everything, and then a lot of other noise comes in, and the end objective is just lost.
Roshan, very quickly, Saliya, anything to add on labor market reforms?
Aging population, I think we really need to be mindful of this, and that you have this huge pool of labor force or labor which is outside the labor force, which is the female labor. And it was a bit disappointing that this budget really didn't discuss that, or didn't really have too much to address this. And particularly, as Shiran said, given the experience we've had with this pandemic, and with the school closures, with the lockdowns, I think we really need to have thought about this much more closely. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are other countries that have done this before, so we can easily, get some experience from, or at least learn from their experiences actually, and see how we can engage this huge pool of labor that is outside the labor force. That's one. And the other one is, of course, also the self-employed workers and these informal workers. I mean, we're a huge pool informal laborers, and who are very badly affected due to the lockdowns and the pandemic. So we need to see how we can protect. I mean, what kind of protection can be given, just as much as we need to tackle some of these the labor regulations, but we also need to see how, what kind of safety nets are available, because these people who are outside the labor force, or sorry, the informal workers, can be out there if there's a shock. So I think those are some things that also need to be looked at when we are looking at labor regulation.
Saliya, you have anything to add on labor market reform?
Imran, only that I think that reforms are necessary because they're an essential part of overhead costing in terms of project financing from an investment point of view. I do agree that we have to be mindful that our labor market, the actual individual workers, suffer protection, but at the same time, looking at where things are in the current state of the economy, I think we've lost a couple of chances to affect effective reforms. The conflict years were one, perhaps, and COVID period was another. I'm simply hoping that there won't be a recession that we will have to, that will give us the opportunity, the third opportunity. But whatever it is, I think it needs to be done fairly quickly, because the longer it's kept, the more political will be required.
Just one final question to all of you, because this has been touted as a solution by many, including each of you in some of the comments today. Digitization, has been used by many countries to remove a lot of red tape and bring about transparency and so on. What are your views on how that can be applied to Sri Lanka? What are the key areas to focus on? I think initially to get some quick wins and then build further on this.
I think one of the quick wins, if I may go first, is I think we've been talking about this concept of digital ID uh, for about 15, 20 years now. Initially, the issue was, do you need a physical card, or, and then I think that whole procurement process took a long time. But now a lot of countries have done it even without anything physical. And if something like that can come in, it can really be a game changer in the sense of how we collect taxes, how we even look at healthcare, how we look at even trade taxes. And so I think in that sense, there is a big opportunity, and even how we give out welfare and really targeted relief whenever things like the pandemic come out. So I think the best example, which I think a lot of people do quote, is how India has done it with their digital ID, and how I think India Stack and so many other things have been built off this. And if the government decides, okay, we want to give relief to this particular region, if you want to build a toilet, the toilet gets built because cash transfer is made to a particular household, and that is kind of done in that sense. So there's a lot of, I think that's a key piece of tool, and I think the government has realized it's prioritizing it, but it needs to get to the end of it.
Yeah, since I've been talking about the trade issue, I think one is getting the single window facility at customs. I think it is a game changer again, and I think that is something that will facilitate cross-border trade. So I think that is something that really needs to be looked at, because for many reasons, I mean, basically transparency, the whole issue we talked about, transparency and corruption and things like that, and also the time and cost of compliance. I mean, the exporters or even importers, the amount of time they have to spend to clear goods or to have their approvals, it takes a lot of their time. So I think that is definitely something. And though it was implemented, I think it was introduced in 2012. I think it's only still partly automated. Exporters, as we just discussed, still have to submit their documents in hard copy form. Not all agencies are linked. So I think this is something that really needs to be done. And I think we can take an example from countries. I was talking about the Trade Openness Index, and countries like Singapore has this thing called TradeNet. Their Trade Openness Index is 320%. We have Korea, which has also a very good portal, or this kind of one single window concept. They have their trade openness is much higher than ours. So I think these are some examples of how something as simple as that could affect a change in the entire sort of trading network or international trade in Sri Lanka.
I agree with those assessments. Essentially, where the world is going is the more it's able to individualize information in terms of, as Shiran was talking about, the digital ID, the more it is able to individualize intervention, to the point that, I'm not sure if you saw the recent Bond movie, but it talks about genetically sequenced and targeted weapons of mass bioweapons. Now, similarly, and that's a bit far-fetched at this point, but still people are being treated very, very specifically. Medicine is being administered. It's bespoke treatment to individuals. And it doesn't take much to assume that eventually tax collection, incentive granting, as Roshan was pointing out, to people who have been outperformers or outliers in the field of providing solutions to their customers, all of that can be and must follow. That must be the end result of any attempt to digitalize, because Otherwise, it ends up being a weapon of Orwellian nature. You know, Big Brother, we have all your information. You can't do anything without us knowing. Isn't the message? Isn't the reason? It should be less the security part and more the service part that I think we can expect. But I totally agree that we must move away from paper.
Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you on another Restart 21 webinar organized by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom in partnership with Economy Next and also at Shiran Magazine. Thank you.